You could feel it before you were even inside. Not just the smell, although that always came first, drifting through the doorway in layers of furniture polish, warm pastry, boiled vegetables, old carpets, lavender soap, and something slowly cooking in the oven since long before you arrived. It was the feeling of the house itself, the quiet order of it, the sense that every chair belonged to someone, every ornament had its place, and every routine had been repeated so often that nobody needed to explain it anymore. If you grew up visiting your nan's house in Britain back in the 1970s, you will know exactly what this felt like. It was not just a visit, it was a whole Sunday. And at the time, you had no idea that the ordinary details would be the things you remembered most clearly. Number 1, the smell before the door opened. Nan's house had its own smell, but somehow they all seemed to share something too. Furniture polish rubbed into old wood, vegetables slowly boiling, clean laundry from the airing cupboard, warm carpet, talcum powder, and perhaps the faint trace of pipe tobacco if Granddad smoked. You didn't think about it at the time. It was simply the smell of being there. But years later, one little hint of polish, cabbage, or a gas fire on a cold day could send you straight back to that hallway, standing there as a child, coat half off, being told how much you had grown since last time. Number 2, going round the back door. The front door existed, of course, but it was not really for you. The front door was for strangers, the doctor, important visitors, or people delivering serious news. Family went round the back. You walked past the same roses, the same garden gnomes, the same little patch of vegetables, and before you had even reached the door, Nan often appeared as if she had been watching from behind the net curtains the whole time. Of course, she probably had. The door opened, warmth came out, and there she was, wiping her hands on a tea towel, telling you to come in before you caught your death. You weren't visiting a house, you were being taken in by it. Number 3, the hallway with the ticking clock. The hallway had a stillness of its own. Coats hung heavily from hooks. Umbrellas stood in a narrow stand. Somewhere nearby there was always a clock ticking steadily, and it made the whole house feel alive even when nobody was speaking. The telephone often sat on a small table, heavy and serious, its coiled cord only allowing you to move so far. Beside it was a notepad, a pencil, and a list of numbers written in careful handwriting. Nobody wandered around the house while talking on the phone. You stood there, speaking in a voice everyone else could hear, while someone in the kitchen pretended not to listen. And all the while, the clock kept ticking. Number 4, the front room nobody used. Every child knew there was one room you did not really belong in. The best room, the front room, the room kept for visitors, Christmas, funerals, and occasions so formal they seemed almost imaginary. It was colder than the rest of the house because the fire was rarely lit in there, and the air felt still, as though the room had been holding its breath for years. The sofa looked perfect because nobody sat on it properly. A glass cabinet might stand against the wall, filled with china animals, commemorative plates, crystal bowls, thimbles, and things from holidays nobody ever seemed to use. You were told not to touch them before you had even thought of touching them. And of course, once told, you wanted to touch them more. Number 5. Nan's kitchen. The kitchen was where the house truly lived. It was warmer, busier, and less careful than the front room, filled with cupboards opening, spoons clinking, pans shifting, and Nan moving from one task to another without seeming to stop. The kettle was put on almost immediately, whether tea was needed or not, because tea was not just a drink. It was the proper beginning of everything. Worktops might have been formica, the table covered with a wipe-clean floral cloth, and near the sink there was always fairy liquid, a dishcloth and a drainer stacked in a way that looked impossible but somehow never collapsed. Tea was made properly too, in a pot, usually under a knitted tea cosy that nobody questioned. That kitchen was Nan's territory. Everyone understood that. Number 6. The biscuit tin gamble. The biscuit tin was one of the great emotional risks of childhood. From the outside, it promised everything. It might have been an old quality street tin, a roses tin, or something decorated with shortbread, flowers, or a village scene. If you lifted the lid and found biscuits, the day immediately improved. Custard creams, bourbons, rich tea, ginger nuts, maybe a digestive or two. But if the lid came off and you saw needles, buttons, thread, safety pins, and a measuring tape tangled at the bottom, the disappointment was almost personal. Every child knew that betrayal, and yet, even after being fooled once, you still checked it again the next time. Because hope, especially where biscuits were concerned, was stronger than common sense. In the room everyone actually used, there was one chair that belonged to Granddad. Nobody needed to say it. You simply knew. Even if he was outside in the shed or standing in the kitchen doorway, that chair remained his, with its worn arms, flattened cushion, and its position facing the television at exactly the right angle. The television sat nearby, a heavy wooden box in the corner, sometimes still black and white, sometimes rented, always treated as a proper piece of furniture. The radio times, or TV times, might be on the arm of the chair, folded open to whatever program mattered that evening. And when something important came on, conversation lowered. People watched together. No pausing. No scrolling. If you missed it, you missed it. Number 8. The fire everyone sat too close to. The fire was often the heart of the room, especially when the weather turned cold. It might have been a gas fire glowing orange behind a guard, or an electric bar fire giving off heat that felt comforting and slightly dangerous at the same time. When it was first switched on after months of not being used, there was that faint, dusty smell, a warm, metallic scent that seemed to announce winter had properly arrived. Children sat too close to it. Adults told them to move back. Then the adults sat too close to it themselves. You could feel the heat on your shins, sometimes almost too much, while the rest of the room stayed quietly chilly around the edges. Number 9. Sunday dinner and pudding. All through the visit, dinner was happening in the background. You could smell it long before you saw it, drifting through rooms as meat roasted, potatoes crisped, vegetables boiled, and gravy thickened. A proper Sunday dinner was not casual. It took time. When the roast came out, Granddad often carved the meat, and it was treated with a seriousness that made the meal feel almost ceremonial. Nan might have cooked everything, timed everything, and remembered who liked what, but the carving still belonged to him. After dinner came pudding, not dessert, pudding, tinned peaches with evaporated milk, rice pudding with the skin on top, steamed sponge with jam or syrup, and bird's custard poured generously over everything. You might have been full already, but that rarely mattered. There was always room because Nan said there was. Number 10. The coin, the leftovers, and the wave goodbye. Leaving Nan's house was never quick. Coats were fetched from the hallway, adults remembered one more thing, and Nan appeared with something wrapped up because you never left empty-handed. Leftovers in foil, slices of cake in a tin that had to be returned next time, vegetables from the garden in a carrier bag, or something she had found in a cupboard and decided your family could use. And sometimes, just before you left, Granddad would press a coin into your hand, quietly. A 50p piece perhaps, or whatever he had in his pocket, placed into your palm with a look that suggested this was between you and him. Then came the doorway, the final reminders, the final comments about the weather. You walked down the path, turned back, and Nan was still there, standing in the doorway or watching from the window, hand raised, waiting until you were properly out of sight. At the time, it was just part of leaving. Years later, it becomes one of the clearest images of all, because you realize she did it every time, not because she had to, because she loved you. And perhaps that is why Nan's house stays with people so strongly, not because it was grand, not because it was perfect, but because it had a rhythm, a warmth, and a kind of love that did not always announce itself in big words. It was in the tea made before you asked, the biscuit tin that might or might not contain biscuits, the chair nobody else sat in, the smell of dinner coming from the kitchen, the coin pressed quietly into your hand, the wave from the doorway as you left. At the time, it all seemed completely ordinary. Just another Sunday, just another visit, just Nan's house. But years later you realize those ordinary Sundays were never ordinary at all.